August Day. In 48 BC, two titans of Rome stood on opposite sides of a Greek battlefield, each commanding legions that had once fought together under the same eagle standards. One was the people's champion, a military genius who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon. The other was Rome's greatest general, the man who had vanquished pirates, crushed Spartacus's rebellion, and expanded the Republic to its furthest reaches. Their names were Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Within hours, one of them would be broken forever, and the Roman Republic, that ancient institution that had stood for nearly 5 centuries, would breathe its last. This is the story of how personal ambition, political betrayal, and a single day of bloodshed changed the course of Western civilization. This is the Battle of Pharsalus. To understand how Rome's two greatest men became mortal enemies, we must journey back 11 years earlier, to a time when they were not rivals, but allies. The year was 59 BC, and Rome was drowning in corruption, political gridlock, and the growing realization that the Republic's institutions were no longer capable of governing an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. 3 men saw this weakness as opportunity. They were Gaius Julius Caesar, an ambitious politician from an ancient but impoverished patrician family; Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, whose fortune was built on the ashes of Sulla's proscriptions; and Pompey the Great, the Republic's most celebrated general, a man who had earned his cognomen Magnus the Great before he was even 30 years old. These 3 formed what history would call the First Triumvirate, though the Romans themselves never used that term. It was not a legal arrangement, but a private pact, a conspiracy of power hidden behind the facade of republican legitimacy. Each man brought something vital to the alliance. Caesar provided political cunning and popular support. Crassus offered his immense wealth and connections among Rome's equestrian class. Pompey contributed his military prestige and the loyalty of his veteran soldiers. Together, they were unstoppable. They dominated the Senate, pushed through legislation that benefited their interests, and carved up Rome's territories like merchants dividing merchandise. For Caesar, the triumvirate was a stepping stone to what he truly desired: military glory and the consulship, followed by a major provincial command. In 58 BC, he achieved his goal, receiving the governorship of 3 provinces: Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. For the next 9 years, Caesar would be far from Rome, campaigning in the misty forests and brutal winters of Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium. But Caesar was not simply fighting Rome's enemies. He was building something far more dangerous to the Republic, a personal army of hardened veterans who were loyal not to Rome, but to him alone. The Gallic Wars were a masterpiece of military achievement and shameless self-promotion. Caesar wrote his own account of the campaigns, the famous Commentarii de Bello Gallico, sending regular dispatches back to Rome that portrayed him as the Republic's defender against barbarian hordes. He fought the Helvetii, the Germanic tribes under Ariovistus, and crossed the Rhine to intimidate the German kingdoms beyond. He even launched 2 expeditions to the mysterious island of Britannia, a land at the very edge of the known world. By the end of his campaigns, Caesar had killed or enslaved approximately 1 million Gauls, adding vast territories to Rome's domain. He had also become fabulously wealthy from plunder and the sale of slaves, using this wealth to bribe politicians in Rome and distribute gifts to the urban poor who loved him. But while Caesar was building his legend in Gaul, the triumvirate was crumbling back in Rome. The first crack appeared in 54 BC, when Julia, Caesar's beloved daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. This marriage had been the personal bond that held Caesar and Pompey together. Without Julia, they were simply political allies, with no family tie to ensure loyalty. The second, and more devastating blow, came in 53 BC, when Crassus, seeking military glory to match that of his partners, led a disastrous campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east. At the Battle of Carrhae, Crassus and 7 legions were annihilated by Parthian horse archers. Crassus himself was killed, his severed head used as a prop in a performance of Euripides during the Parthian king's celebrations. With Crassus dead and Julia gone, only Caesar and Pompey remained. The balance of power that had stabilized Rome for a decade was broken. Pompey, always sensitive to his dignitas, his honor and public standing, began to feel threatened by Caesar's growing popularity. Every victory in Gaul made Caesar more beloved by the Roman people, more indispensable to the Republic. Pompey had once been Rome's sole military hero. Now he had a rival. The Senate, that august body of Rome's aristocratic elite, recognized this jealousy and exploited it masterfully. Led by conservative senators like Marcus Porcius Cato and Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, the Optimates faction saw an opportunity to turn Pompey against Caesar. They whispered in Pompey's ear, reminding him of Caesar's ambitions, suggesting that Caesar intended to march on Rome and make himself king. They flattered Pompey, appointed him sole consul in 52 BC after the murder of the populist politician Clodius had plunged Rome into chaos, and gradually positioned him as the Senate's champion against the threat they claimed Caesar represented. Pompey, for all his military genius, was politically naive. He believed the Senate truly valued him, that they saw him as first among equals. He failed to understand that the Optimates were simply using him as a weapon against Caesar, and that once Caesar was destroyed they would turn on Pompey himself. But in 52 and 51 BC, Pompey allowed himself to be seduced by senatorial flattery. He began distancing himself from Caesar, supporting legislation that would force Caesar to give up his provinces before he could stand for a second consulship. This was the critical issue that would spark civil war. Under Roman law, a provincial governor could be prosecuted for crimes once he returned to private citizenship. Caesar knew that the moment he laid down his command, his enemies in the Senate, led by Cato, would immediately bring him to trial for alleged illegalities during his first consulship and his campaigns in Gaul. The charges would be politically motivated, but conviction was likely, and the penalty could be exile or even death. Caesar's only protection was to move directly from his provincial command to a second consulship, which would grant him legal immunity. But the Senate, backed by Pompey, was determined to create a gap between his governorship and any future consulship, a gap during which Caesar would be vulnerable. As 50 BC turned to 49 BC, negotiations between Caesar and the Senate broke down completely. Caesar made several offers of compromise. He proposed that both he and Pompey should simultaneously give up their commands, creating a level playing field. The Senate rejected this. He offered to retain only Cisalpine Gaul and 1 legion while giving up his other provinces. Again, rejection. The Optimates, confident that Pompey's legions would defeat Caesar if it came to war, demanded total surrender. Caesar must give up his provinces, disband his army, and return to Rome as a private citizen to face whatever judgment the Senate decreed. On January 7th, 49 BC, the Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree, which effectively declared martial law and called upon Pompey to defend the Republic against Caesar. 2 tribunes of the plebs, who had been vetoing anti-Caesar legislation, Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony, and Quintus Cassius Longinus, were forced to flee Rome in disguise, a violation of their sacred office that gave Caesar the propaganda victory he needed. Caesar was at Ravenna, the southernmost city of his province of Cisalpine Gaul, when news of the Senate's ultimatum reached him. He was 51 years old, balding, epileptic, but possessed of an energy and determination that put men half his age to shame. He had with him only 1 legion, The 13th, roughly 5,000 men who had followed him through the hell of Gallic warfare. His other legions were scattered across Gaul, weeks away by forced march. According to the ancient sources, Caesar spent the day before his decision feasting with friends, showing no outward sign of anxiety. That evening, he told his companions he needed to visit some gladiators who were training in Ravenna. Instead, he rode south with a small cavalry escort. The boundary between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper was marked by a small stream called the Rubicon. Under Roman law, no general could bring an army into Italy itself without permission from the Senate. To cross the Rubicon with armed soldiers was an act of war against the Republic itself. At the river's edge, Caesar paused. The ancient historian Suetonius tells us that he hesitated, contemplating the magnitude of what he was about to do. Then, according to legend, he uttered the Greek phrase that would echo through history: "Anarypho kubos," the die is cast. Caesar and his cavalry splashed across the stream in the darkness of night. Behind them came the 13th Legion. The Roman Civil War had begun. What followed was not the devastating conflict Caesar's enemies had expected, but a brilliant campaign of speed and psychological warfare. Caesar raced down the Italian peninsula, faster than news of his coming, seizing towns before their garrisons could organize resistance. He treated captured soldiers and civilians with unprecedented clemency, a calculated move designed to contrast his mercy with the Optimate's reputation for cruelty. The strategy worked magnificently. Town after town opened its gates without a fight. Soldiers sent to stop him instead joined his ranks. Pompey, who had boasted that he needed only to stamp his foot and legions would spring from the soil of Italy, discovered that his veterans had mostly retired to farms and had no desire to leave their families to fight Caesar's hardened Gallic legionaries. Pompey made the strategic decision to abandon Italy entirely. He and the conservative senators, along with their armies, retreated first to Brundisium on Italy's heel, then crossed the Adriatic to Greece and the east. The decision was militarily sound. In the eastern provinces, Pompey had vast resources, loyal client kings, and time to train new legions. But politically, it was a disaster. To the Roman people, it looked like Pompey and the Senate were fleeing before Caesar's advance, abandoning Rome itself to the so-called tyrant. Caesar entered Rome without bloodshed in April 49 BC. He made no purges, no prescriptions like the ones that had stained Rome's streets with blood during the time of Sulla and Marius. Instead, he presented himself as the restorer of peace, the defender of the people's rights, and the victim of senatorial tyranny. He stayed in Rome only long enough to secure his political position, having himself appointed dictator by the remaining senators, then set off in pursuit of Pompey. But Caesar's path to Greece was blocked by Pompey's forces in Spain. Marcus Petreius and Lucius Afranius commanded 7 legions loyal to Pompey in Hispania. Rather than divide his forces, Caesar decided to, in his own words, go and defeat an army without a commander, before returning to defeat a commander without an army. The Spanish campaign lasted from April to August 49 BC and showcased Caesar's brilliance. Through rapid maneuvering and engineering genius, he trapped the Pompeian forces near the town of Ilerda without fighting a major battle. Cut off from water and supplies, Afranius and Petreius had no choice but to surrender. Again, Caesar showed clemency, allowing the defeated soldiers to return home or join his own ranks. With Spain secured, Caesar returned to Italy and prepared to cross to Greece in pursuit of Pompey. But Pompey controlled the sea. His admiral, Marcus Bibulus, commanded a fleet that patrolled the Adriatic, making any crossing extremely dangerous. Caesar, however, was not a man to wait for favorable conditions. In January 48 BC, in the middle of winter, when no sane commander would attempt a naval operation, Caesar loaded 7 legions onto whatever ships he could gather and sailed straight into Pompeian-controlled waters. Luck and audacity were with him. The ships evaded Bibulus's patrols and landed on the Greek coast at Palaest. Caesar immediately marched south and laid siege to Dyrrhachium, a crucial port city where Pompey had established his base, but this time Caesar had overextended himself. His supply lines were tenuous, his forces outnumbered, and Pompey held every advantage. The siege of Dyrrhachium turned into one of Caesar's worst defeats. Pompey commanded a force nearly twice the size of Caesar's, approximately 55,000 men against Caesar's 30,000. He also had unlimited supplies coming by sea, while Caesar's army was slowly starving. Caesar attempted to trap Pompey's forces with a massive line of fortifications, but Pompey's engineers countered with their own walls. The two armies stared at each other across elaborate siege works, in what became the largest fortified camp in ancient history, with Caesar's walls stretching for 15 miles. Then disaster struck Caesar's forces. 2 Gallic chieftains who served in Caesar's cavalry defected to Pompey, revealing the location of weak points in Caesar's fortifications. Pompey launched a massive assault at these vulnerable spots. Caesar's lines broke. His soldiers, exhausted and hungry, fled in panic. It was only Caesar's personal intervention, riding into the midst of retreating troops, grabbing men by their shoulders and turning them back to face the enemy, that prevented the rout from becoming a complete annihilation. Even so, Caesar lost nearly 1,000 men in the disaster at Dyrrhachium. Pompey had achieved what many thought impossible. He had defeated Julius Caesar in open battle. His officers urged him to pursue and destroy Caesar's fleeing army. But Pompey, perhaps remembering Caesar's capacity for surprise, perhaps simply exhausted himself, decided not to follow. Caesar would later remark that Pompey could have ended the war that day if he had only known how to use his victory. Instead, Caesar's battered army escaped southward into Thessaly, the great plain of central Greece. As Caesar's forces limped away from Dyrrhachium, morale was at its lowest point. Soldiers who had followed Caesar through Gaul, across the Rubicon, and to the shores of Greece, now questioned whether they had chosen the wrong side. Ancient sources record that some of Caesar's officers came to him suggesting surrender or negotiation. Caesar refused. In his mind, retreat was not an option. He had crossed the Rubicon. He had declared war on the Senate and Pompey. There could be no compromise now, no middle path. It was total victory or utter destruction. Caesar led his army deeper into Thessaly, toward the town of Pharsalus. He had several reasons for this movement. First, Thessaly was agricultural heartland, a region of grain fields where his starving soldiers might finally find adequate food. Second, by moving inland, he was luring Pompey away from his secure coastal bases and naval supply lines. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Caesar understood psychology. His men needed a victory to restore their shattered confidence, and Pompey, flushed with his success at Dyrrhachium, might be overconfident enough to give him that opportunity. Pompey followed. He could not afford to let Caesar recover unmolested. But as Pompey's army pursued Caesar into Thessaly, something began to change in the Pompeian camp. The conservative senators who had fled to Greece with Pompey, men like Cato, Metellus Scipio, and Domitius Ahenobarbus, grew increasingly arrogant. They believed victory was inevitable. In their minds, Caesar was a beaten man leading a defeated army. They began to quarrel among themselves, not about whether they would win, but about how they would divide the spoils after Caesar's destruction. The ancient historians, particularly Plutarch and Appian, record the grotesque spectacle that unfolded in Pompey's tent during the march to Pharsalus. Senators argued over who would receive Caesar's position as Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. They debated which of them would be awarded the consulships and provincial governorships in the new order they would establish after victory. They spoke of Caesar's followers as if they were already dead, discussing the confiscation of their property and the proscription of their families. Some even composed poetry celebrating Pompey's upcoming triumph. Pompey himself was uncomfortable with this premature celebration. He was an experienced enough commander to know that Caesar was never more dangerous than when cornered. He preferred to continue his strategy of attrition, following Caesar while avoiding battle, letting hunger and desertion destroy his enemy's army without risking his own men. But the senators would not hear of caution. They mocked Pompey, suggesting he was prolonging the war to maintain his importance. They accused him of cowardice. They said he was afraid to fight Caesar. Under this constant pressure from his own nominal allies, Pompey's resolve began to weaken. By late July or early August of 48 BC, the exact date is debated among scholars. The two armies had maneuvered into position near Pharsalus. Caesar had approximately 22,000 legionaries and 1,000 cavalry. Pompey commanded around 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. The numbers heavily favored Pompey, particularly in cavalry, where his advantage was overwhelming. Any conventional military analysis would predict a Pompeian victory, but Julius Caesar was not a conventional commander. The terrain near Pharsalus was a wide plain broken by the Enipeus River. Caesar established his camp on the plain itself, deploying his forces each morning in battle formation. Challenging Pompey to fight for several days, Pompey refused. He kept his army on higher ground near his fortified camp, declining Caesar's provocations, but the pressure from the senators continued. Finally, Pompey gave in to their demands. On the morning of August 9th, 48 BC by our modern calendar, the Pompeian army descended from the hills and deployed for battle. Caesar could hardly believe his fortune. According to his own account, he had been preparing to break camp and move to another position when scouts brought word that Pompey's forces were finally coming down to the plain. Caesar immediately ordered his legions to form battle lines. After months of maneuvering, hunger, and defeat at Dyrrhachium, the decisive battle was finally at hand. The deployments reflected each commander's strategy. Pompey placed his best legion, the first, on his left flank next to the river, where they would anchor his line. In the center, he positioned his numerous other legions in a formation 3 lines deep, the standard Roman deployment. But Pompey's real strength was on his right flank. Here he massed his 7,000 cavalry, supported by archers and slingers from the eastern provinces. His plan was straightforward. The cavalry would sweep around Caesar's left flank, then crash into the rear of Caesar's legions while they were engaged with Pompey's infantry. Caught between hammer and anvil, Caesar's army would be annihilated. It was a sound strategy, the kind that had won Pompey countless victories against. Caesar arranged his forces in his typical 3-line formation. On his right flank, facing Pompey's first legion across the river, he created a 4th line, a hidden. Caesar had observed that cavalry, particularly aristocratic cavalry like Pompey's, were more concerned with preserving their good looks and status than with dying for glory. If his theory was correct, facing an unexpected threat to their faces would break their nerve. As the morning sun climbed higher, making the August heat almost unbearable, the two armies stood facing each other, across perhaps 400 yards of dusty Thessalian plain. On one side, the might of the Roman Senate and the greatest general of the age, confident in their numbers and righteousness of their cause. On the other, a smaller force of veterans who had followed their commander through hell and back, who had no homes to return to if they lost, who knew that defeat meant death or slavery for them and their families. Caesar rode along his lines on horseback, shouting encouragement to his men. Ancient sources preserve fragments of his speech. He reminded them of their victories in Gaul, their courage at Dyrrhachium despite the defeat, the justice of their cause against senatorial tyranny. He told them to aim for Pompey's face, knowing that many of Pompey's soldiers were young recruits who had never experienced the true horror of Roman battle. Most importantly, He reminded his men that they were fighting for their lives, while Pompey's soldiers were fighting for the ambitions of aristocrats who despised them. Across the field, Pompey addressed his own troops. His speech, as recorded by Plutarch, was more cautious, more technical. He outlined the battle plan, emphasized their numerical superiority, and expressed confidence in victory. But there was something missing in Pompey's words, a lack of the passion and personal connection that Caesar inspired in his men. Pompey was a great general, but he had never cultivated the intense personal loyalty that Caesar commanded. His soldiers respected him, but they did not love him. The signal was given. Pompey's legions began their advance, the earth trembling beneath thousands of hobnailed sandals striking the ground in unison. The legendary Roman battle formations, the manipular system perfected over centuries of warfare, moved forward like a vast machine of destruction. Shields locked together, short swords drawn, the Pompeian infantry marched to end Julius Caesar's rebellion and restore the Republic. But Caesar's veterans did not move. They stood motionless in their lines, watching the enemy advance. This was deliberate. Caesar had trained his men in a tactic he had developed during the Gallic Wars. By allowing the enemy to exhaust themselves in the charge while his own troops remained fresh, he gained a critical advantage. The Pompeian soldiers, weighted down with armor and equipment, ran across 400 yards under the blazing Mediterranean sun. By the time they reached Caesar's lines, they were gasping for breath, their formations loosened by the charge. Now Caesar's trumpets sounded. His legions surged forward, closing the final distance while Pompey's men were still recovering from their run. The two lines collided with a sound like thunder, a crash of shield on shield, metal on metal, man against man. The carefully organized formations dissolved into a vast, churning melee of individual struggles. Soldiers pushed and hacked at each other in the suffocating press of bodies, where there was barely room to swing a gladius, where men died without ever seeing their killers. In the center of the line, the battle was everything Roman warfare was known for: brutal, disciplined, and horrifically efficient. Caesar's veterans, outnumbered but more experienced, matched the Pompeian legions man for man. They used their shields not just for defense, but as weapons, slamming the heavy wooden boards into enemies' faces, breaking noses and teeth. They worked their short swords with the mechanical precision of butchers, stabbing upward into groins and bellies where armor was weakest. The ground became slippery with blood, the air filled with the screams of wounded men, the clash of weapons, and the shouted orders of centurions trying to maintain some semblance of control in the chaos. But the real battle, the decisive moment that would determine the fate of Rome, was developing on the flanks. Pompey's cavalry, 7,000 strong, began their charge against Caesar's left wing. These were not just any horsemen. Among their ranks rode the flower of Roman aristocracy, senators' sons, wealthy equestrians, allied nobles from across the Mediterranean. They wore gleaming armor, carried the finest weapons, and had trained in horsemanship since childhood. They vastly outnumbered Caesar's 1,000 cavalry, and they knew it. Caesar's cavalry did not even attempt to hold their position. Following their orders, they wheeled away from Pompey's charge, deliberately exposing the flank of Caesar's infantry line. To the Pompeian cavalry, it must have seemed like the final proof of their inevitable victory. The enemy was breaking before them without a fight. They spurred their horses forward, racing to get behind Caesar's legions and complete the encirclement. And then, Caesar's hidden fourth line revealed itself. 3,000 hardened infantrymen, the pick of Caesar's legions, suddenly appeared from behind the retreating cavalry. They moved at a run, not in the traditional three-line formation, but in a more compact mass designed to meet a cavalry charge. As Pompey's horsemen bore down on them, expecting terrified infantry easy to ride down, these veterans did something no Roman soldier had done in living memory. Instead of throwing their javelins from a distance, they held them as spears and thrust upward at the riders' faces. The psychological effect was devastating. Pompey's aristocratic cavalry, confronted with iron points aimed at their eyes and throats, panicked. These were men accustomed to war as a path to glory and political advancement, not as a place where their handsome faces might be ruined or their lives brutally ended. The front ranks tried to rein in their horses, causing those behind to crash into them. The orderly charge dissolved into confusion, and Caesar's veterans, sensing the enemy's fear, pressed forward with savage efficiency. Within minutes, Pompey's cavalry advantage had not just disappeared, but reversed into disaster. The 7,000 horsemen, their nerve broken, wheeled their horses and fled the battlefield. They rode not toward their own camp, but away from the battle entirely, seeking only to escape the grim infantry that had shattered their charge. With them fled the archers and slingers who had been supporting their advance. An entire wing of Pompey's army had evaporated. Caesar's fourth line did not stop to celebrate. Following their commander's precise orders, they immediately pivoted and began to advance against the flank of Pompey's infantry, who were still locked in desperate combat with Caesar's main line. The Pompeian legionaries, fighting desperately in the center, suddenly found themselves attacked from the side. The carefully maintained formations began to break down as men turned to face this unexpected threat, creating gaps and confusion. Caesar, watching from behind his lines, saw the moment of crisis in the enemy formation. This was his genius as a commander, not just the ability to plan brilliant tactics, but the instinct to recognize the precise instant when a battle could be won. He gave the signal for his third line, his reserves, to join the battle. Fresh troops surged forward, crashing into Pompey's already wavering center. The discipline that had made Rome's legions the terror of the ancient world now worked against Pompey's soldiers. Roman military training emphasized maintaining formation, following orders, and trusting the man beside you. But when that formation broke, when the men beside you began to fall or flee, that same training became a liability. Pompey's soldiers, many of them recent recruits who had never faced Caesar's veterans in battle, began to crack under the pressure. From his command position, Pompey watched his cavalry flee and his infantry line begin to crumble. Plutarch tells us that something broke inside the great general at that moment. This was the man who had conquered the East, who had defeated Sertorius in Spain, who had crushed the slave rebellion of Spartacus. He had never lost a major battle in his entire career, and now, on a dusty plain in Greece, he was watching Julius Caesar destroy his army. Pompey removed his general's cloak, the symbol of his command. Without a word to his staff officers, without attempting to rally his troops or organize a fighting retreat, he turned his horse and rode away from the battle. The greatest general of Rome abandoned his army in the midst of combat and fled toward his camp. It was an act of such uncharacteristic cowardice that ancient historians struggled to explain it. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps it was the realization that everything he had built, all his glory and dignitas, was collapsing around him. Or perhaps Pompey simply recognized that the battle was lost and saw no reason to die in a futile last stand. Without their commander, the Pompeian army's collapse accelerated. Legions that might have retreated in good order instead dissolved into a mob of terrified men trying to escape. Caesar's veterans pursued with ruthless efficiency, cutting down fleeing soldiers from behind. The rout carried the survivors back to the Pompeian camp, a fortified position on the hills where their tents and supplies were located. Some of Pompey's soldiers tried to make a stand there, forming defensive positions behind the camp's walls. But Caesar gave his exhausted men no rest. He understood that a routed army must be given no time to recover, no opportunity to regroup. He ordered an immediate assault on the camp. His legionaries, still high on adrenaline from their victory, scrambled up the hillside and stormed the fortifications. The battle, which had begun that morning on the plain, continued into the afternoon among the tents and supply wagons of Pompey's camp. Inside his tent, Pompey sat in silence as the sounds of battle drew closer. Ancient sources describe him as being in a state of shock, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. Only when Caesar's soldiers began breaking into the camp itself did Pompey finally move. He emerged from his tent, still without his general's cloak, and mounted a horse. With a handful of loyal companions, he rode out through a rear gate just as Caesar's men were entering through the front. The storming of Pompey's camp revealed the arrogance that had infected his army before the battle. Caesar's soldiers found tables laden with food, prepared for a victory feast. They discovered garlands and wreaths that Pompeian officers had prepared to wear during their anticipated triumph. Some tents were decorated with fresh flowers, and couches arranged as if for a banquet. The contrast between this preparation for celebration and the reality of their crushing defeat must have seemed bitterly ironic to the victorious Caesarians. But not all of the Pompeian army had fled to the camp. Some legions, maintaining better discipline, retreated to a hill near the battlefield. These men, perhaps 15,000 strong, formed a defensive position and prepared to make a last stand. They were exhausted, demoralized, and surrounded, but they were still Roman soldiers, and many preferred to die fighting rather than surrender to Caesar. Caesar approached this position cautiously as evening began to fall. He had won a great victory, but he knew that attacking a fortified position held by desperate men could cost him thousands of casualties. Instead, he ordered his troops to surround the hill and begin constructing siege works. His message to the trapped Pompeians was clear: surrender now, or face a siege with no food, water, or hope of relief. As night fell over the battlefield of Pharsalus, the trapped Pompeian soldiers considered their options. They had heard of Caesar's clemency, his policy of pardoning defeated enemies, but they also knew they had been fighting to destroy him, to end his political career and possibly his life. Would his mercy extend to them? As they debated through the night, they could see the campfires of Caesar's army surrounding them, could hear the sounds of digging as siege works were constructed. By dawn, they had made their decision. Envoys emerged from the Pompeian position carrying olive branches, the ancient symbol of surrender. They approached Caesar's lines and were brought before the general himself. Caesar's response was characteristically calculated. He would accept their surrender, he told them, on the condition that they lay down their arms immediately. They would not be enslaved or executed. The common soldiers would be free to return home, or, if they wished, to join his own legions. Even the officers would be spared, though they would be held as prisoners until the civil war was concluded. It was an offer almost unprecedented in ancient warfare. The traditional Roman practice after victory was enslavement or execution of defeated enemies, but Caesar understood something that Pompey and the Senate had never grasped. Every man he executed created a family of enemies. Every man he pardoned might become an ally. His clemency was not weakness, but policy, a calculated method of winning not just battles, but the ultimate prize, acceptance by the Roman people as their rightful leader. The trapped Pompeians accepted his terms. 15,000 men descended from their hill and laid down their weapons before Caesar's legions. They were disarmed, catalogued, and then, as promised, most were allowed to depart. Some, seeing which way the wind was blowing, chose to take the oath to Caesar and join his army. They would fight for him in the campaigns to come, in Egypt and Africa and Spain, as loyal as any of his Gallic veterans. The butcher's bill from Pharsalus was staggering, though ancient sources differ on exact numbers. Caesar, in his own account, claims that Pompey lost 15,000 dead, while his own casualties were only 200 men, a suspiciously convenient ratio. Modern historians consider these figures propaganda, More realistic estimates suggest that Pompey suffered around 6,000 dead and 24,000 captured, while Caesar's losses were probably closer to 1,200 killed. By ancient standards, where battles often ended with mutual exhaustion rather than the complete destruction of one side, Pharsalus was an unusually decisive victory. But numbers alone do not capture the magnitude of what had occurred. The cream of the Roman nobility lay dead on that Greek field. The sons of senators, the proud cavalry of the aristocratic class, the legions that were supposed to defend the Republic, all had been shattered by a smaller force of hardened veterans commanded by a single brilliant general. The Senate's attempt to stop Caesar through military force had failed catastrophically. Pompey, meanwhile, was fleeing for his life. He rode to the coast, where he boarded a merchant ship and sailed east. According to Plutarch, Pompey was barely recognizable, his face haggard, his famous dignity shattered. He stopped briefly at Mytilene to collect his wife Cornelia and his younger son Sextus, then continued toward Egypt. He hoped that young King Ptolemy XIII, whom Pompey had helped place on the throne years earlier, would grant him sanctuary and perhaps even military aid to continue the fight. Caesar pursued with his characteristic speed. He took only a small force, perhaps 4,000 men, and sailed after Pompey. His army had been ordered to follow by land, but Caesar would not wait. He was determined to capture or kill Pompey, to ensure that his rival could never again raise an army against him. The chase would lead Caesar to Egypt, and to events that no one could have predicted. On September 28, 48 BC, Pompey's ship approached the harbor of Pelusium in Egypt. A small boat came out to meet him, sent by the young pharaoh's advisors. Pompey, perhaps hoping for a royal welcome, descended into the boat along with his wife and son. As the boat approached the shore, one of its occupants, a Roman soldier named Lucius Septimius, who had once served under Pompey himself, suddenly drew his sword and stabbed Pompey in the back. Other assassins joined in the attack. Cornelia and Sextus watched in horror from their ship as Pompey Magnus, the great general of Rome, was murdered in a small boat in Egyptian waters. The Egyptians decapitated Pompey and preserved his head, intending to present it to Caesar as a gift, a gesture they believed would win them Caesar's favor. They cremated the body on the beach and collected the ashes. When Caesar arrived in Egypt 3 days later, the royal advisors proudly presented him with Pompey's severed head and signet ring. Caesar's reaction was not what they expected. According to multiple ancient sources, Caesar wept. Whether these were genuine tears for a former friend and father-in-law, or crocodile tears for political effect, we cannot know. But Caesar immediately ordered the Egyptians to return Pompey's ashes, which he had buried with honor in a shrine near Alexandria. Caesar's reaction to Pompey's assassination reveals the complexity of the man. He had pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean, determined to destroy him politically and militarily. But he had not wanted this sordid murder, this undignified end for Rome's greatest general. Perhaps Caesar recognized that Pompey's death, by assassination, rather than in battle, or by Caesar's own judgment, robbed him of the full glory of his victory. Or perhaps, in that moment, Caesar genuinely mourned the man who had once been his ally and the husband of his beloved daughter Julia. Egypt would prove nearly fatal to Caesar. He became entangled in the civil war between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII, the famous queen who would become his lover and bear him a son. He was besieged in Alexandria with only his small force, fighting for months against a much larger Egyptian army. But that is another story. For our purposes, what matters is that after Pharsalus, no one could seriously challenge Caesar's military supremacy. The war, however, was not quite over. Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, escaped and would continue fighting. Cato, that stern defender of republican virtue, fled to North Africa where he rallied the remaining Pompeian forces. Metellus Scipio and other senatorial leaders joined him there. For the next 2 years, Caesar would campaign in Egypt, Asia Minor, where he won a lightning victory and sent his famous dispatch Veni, Vidi, Vici back to Rome. Then North Africa, where he finally destroyed the last major Pompeian army at the Battle of Thapsus in 46 BC. Even then, Pompey's sons would continue resisting in Spain until Caesar defeated them at Munda in 45 BC. But while these battles were significant, they were epilogues to the real drama that had concluded at Pharsalus. On that August day in 48 BC, the Roman Republic had received its death blow, not because the institution ceased to exist in legal terms. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, tribunes still vetoed legislation, but the reality of power had shifted irreversibly. One man commanded an army more loyal to him personally than to the state. One man had defeated the combined forces of the Senate and Rome's greatest general. One man was now, in everything but name, King of Rome. Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BC as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. He was appointed dictator, first for 10 years, then for life. He implemented massive reforms. He reorganized the calendar, creating the Julian calendar, which, with minor modifications, we still use today. He settled his veterans in colonies across the empire. He expanded the Senate, bringing in representatives from Italy and the provinces, diluting the power of the old aristocratic families. He began construction projects that would employ Rome's urban poor. He reformed debt laws and tried to address the massive inequality that plagued Roman society. But Caesar also accepted honors that struck at the heart of republican tradition. His image appeared on coins, a practice previously reserved for dead heroes and gods. Statues of him were erected across Rome. The month of his birth was renamed Julius, our July. He was given the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. Some senators proposed making him king, a title that had been anathema to Romans since they expelled their last king 500 years earlier. To many Romans, particularly the old aristocratic class, Caesar's reforms and honors proved that their worst fears had been justified. He was destroying the Republic, the mixed constitution of consuls, senate, and people that had made Rome great. He was concentrating all power in his own hands, making himself a monarch in everything but name. A conspiracy began to form among the senators, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, men whom Caesar had pardoned and trusted. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, less than 4 years after Pharsalus, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Senate House. His murderers stabbed him 23 times at the base of Pompey's statue, a bitter irony that ancient historians noted with grim satisfaction. The conspirators proclaimed they had saved the Republic, that they had struck down a tyrant just as Brutus's legendary ancestor had overthrown Rome's last king. But they were wrong. The Republic was already dead. Pharsalus had killed it. What followed Caesar's assassination was not the restoration of republican government, but 13 more years of civil war as Caesar's supporters, led by his adopted son, Octavian, and his general Mark Antony, hunted down and destroyed the assassins. When Octavian finally emerged victorious in 31 BC, he did exactly what Caesar had planned, creating a monarchy disguised as a restored republic. He took the name Augustus and became Rome's first emperor. The Roman Republic, that institution that had lasted nearly 500 years, was replaced by the Roman Empire that would endure for another 5 centuries in the West and 1,500 years in the East. The Battle of Pharsalus, then, was more than just a military engagement between two Roman generals. It was the moment when the Republic's long decline became an irreversible collapse. The crisis had been building for a century before Caesar and Pompey faced each other on that Greek battlefield. The Gracchi brothers had tried to reform Rome's land distribution and been murdered by the Senate. Marius and Sulla had fought civil wars that drenched Italy in blood. Spartacus's slave rebellion had revealed the fragility of Rome's social order. The Catiline conspiracy had shown how desperate men would go to overthrow the state. But all of these crises had been overcome. The Republic had survived, adapted, continued. Pharsalus was different. After Pharsalus, there was no going back. The lesson of Caesar's victory was clear. In the Roman world, military power trumped political legitimacy. An army loyal to its general was stronger than the constitutional authority of the Senate and people of Rome. This lesson would be learned and relearned by every general and emperor for the next 5 centuries. It is worth asking what might have happened if Pompey had won at Pharsalus. Would the Republic have been saved? Almost certainly not. Pompey, had he defeated Caesar, would have returned to Rome as an even greater hero than before, with an even more dominant position. The Senate, which had used him against Caesar, would likely have turned against him next. Either Pompey would have had to seize dictatorial power himself to protect his position, or another ambitious general would have risen to challenge him. The fundamental problem was not Caesar or Pompey as individuals, but the system itself. The Roman Republic had been designed to govern a city-state, not an empire. Its complicated system of checks and balances, its annual magistracies and collective decision-making, worked well when Rome controlled only central Italy. But by the 1st century BC, Rome ruled from Spain to Syria, from Gaul to Africa. The military commanders needed to defend and expand this vast territory inevitably became more powerful than the civilian government in Rome. They commanded armies for years or decades, building personal loyalty among troops who looked to their general, not to the distant Senate, for their rewards and retirement. The Republic's political system had no mechanism to control these military strongmen, except by empowering other military strongmen to oppose them, a strategy that could only end in civil war. Caesar understood this. Unlike Pompey, who seemed to genuinely believe in the Republic while simultaneously subverting it, Caesar recognized that the old system was dead and something new was needed. His reforms were an attempt to create that new system, to transition from republic to monarchy while maintaining enough republican forms to avoid triggering Roman hatred of kingship. He failed, not because his vision was wrong, but because he moved too fast and was too open about his intentions. Augustus would succeed where Caesar failed by moving slowly, maintaining republican facades and never openly admitting he had destroyed the Republic. The legacy of Pharsalus echoes through history. It established the pattern of military strongmen overthrowing civilian governments that would be repeated across centuries and continents. It demonstrated that popular support and military genius could overcome numerical superiority and institutional legitimacy. It showed that civil wars, once begun, develop their own terrible momentum that makes compromise impossible. Caesar and Pompey both crossed lines from which they could not retreat. Their conflict had to end with the destruction of one or the other. On a more personal level, Pharsalus was the triumph of one vision of leadership over another. Pompey represented the old model of Roman nobility, a great man who earned glory through military achievement, then expected that glory to translate into political dominance. He wanted to be first among equals, the princeps senatus, the leading man of the Senate, but still bound by republican tradition and senatorial authority. Caesar represented something new, and, to traditional Romans, terrifying. A leader whose connection was directly with the people in the army, who bypassed traditional institutions and relied on personal charisma and military force. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus meant that this new model had defeated the old. For better or worse, the age of the Roman Republic was ending, and the age of the emperors was beginning. Whether this was tragic, as authors from Cicero to Dante have suggested, or necessary and even beneficial, as Augustus's court historians would argue, depends on one's perspective. What is undeniable is that after August 9th, 48 BC, the course of Western civilization had changed forever. The battlefield itself remained a place of memory for centuries. Ancient tourists visited the site of Pharsalus just as modern visitors tour Gettysburg or Waterloo. They wandered the field trying to imagine the clash of armies, the moment when Pompey's cavalry broke, the slaughter as Caesar's veterans pursued the fleeing Pompeians. Plutarch records that in his time, more than a century after the battle, local farmers still found weapons and bones when they plowed the fields. Today, the exact location of the battle is debated by scholars. The Enipeus River has changed course over 2 millennia. The town of Pharsalus has been rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt again. But somewhere in that Thessalian plain, beneath olive groves and wheat fields, lies the spot where Julius Caesar defeated Pompey the Great and ended the Roman Republic. It was a battle that lasted only a few hours, but whose consequences would reshape the ancient world and influence the course of human civilization for 2,000 years. Caesar himself lived only 4 more years after Pharsalus, and his assassins would claim they killed him to prevent him from becoming king. But they were too late. The republic they sought to save had already died on that August day in Greece. All that remained was to determine what would replace it. That question would not be finally answered until Caesar's adopted heir, young Octavian, who would become Augustus, eliminated all rivals and established the Roman Empire. But the die had been cast at Pharsalus. In the end, the Battle of Pharsalus reminds us that history turns on individual moments, on single battles where the fates of nations are decided by the decisions of generals and the courage of soldiers. It reminds us that no political system, no matter how venerable or successful, is permanent. And it reminds us that ambition, when combined with military genius and circumstances of crisis, can reshape the world. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, knowing he was gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. At Pharsalus, he won that gamble. The price of his victory was the death of the Roman Republic. The reward was an empire that would dominate the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries and whose legacy would shape European civilization long after Rome itself had fallen. It was a momentous day, that August afternoon in Thessaly, when 2 armies of Romans fought each other under the burning sun and changed the world forever.